Welcome to Session 6, the Mosaic Era. And this era covers the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and spans roughly between 1475 and 1400 BC. The beginning of the book of Exodus connects its narrative to that of Genesis, tracing how the house of Jacob had been fruitful and multiplied. This seed would now pass through more than a person or a family, but through a people and soon through a nation. These books can roughly be categorized according to three themes: divine redemption, divine morality, and divine worship. So let's begin with divine redemption. The story of Exodus is a story of redemption. We all know how Israel spent 4 generations in Egypt until God raised up Moses to be his instrument before Israel and Pharaoh. This story introduces the language of sonship, as we read in Exodus 4:22. Then say to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so he may worship me." The word used here for son is again used in the singular, another use of this collective idea for the promise. It compares Israel as the son of God to the belief that Pharaoh was a son of God. It therefore should come as no surprise that the terms son, firstborn, and seed are used of Jesus in the New Testament as well. Furthermore, this redemption of Israel in Exodus uses the terminology of a people or a possession. Israel, according to this language, belonged to God, and Pharaoh did not have the right to keep them. God sent plagues to demonstrate a couple of different truths. First, that Yahweh was more powerful than any of the other Egyptian gods. Secondly, that compared to Yahweh, Egyptian gods were in fact no gods at all. And thirdly, that Israel and Egypt should fear what Yahweh could do. Exodus 8:22 states that the plagues were sent so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. Similarly, God destroyed the forces of Egypt for the same purpose, as we read in Exodus 14:4. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. Counterintuitively, the calamities that God sent on Egypt were designed as a vehicle by which God made good on his promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:3, to bless all nations through Israel. These plagues and disasters were designed with a salvific purpose in mind, to demonstrate the power of Yahweh. To demonstrate the power of Yahweh over and against the power of Egypt. God claimed Israel as his own personal possession in such a dramatic way that other nations would fear Yahweh, not just Egypt, but anyone who heard about this. After the evening of Passover, many of the Egyptians actually did join the Israelites in their exodus. Exodus 12 talks about a mixed multitude that went forward. Passover established Yahweh as Israel's Goel, or kinsman redeemer. And notice that God did this unilaterally. He did this by himself, that there was very little, if any, initiative that Israel had to take in their exodus. The story of the Exodus is a remarkable fulfillment of God's promise to be our God and to create for himself a people. This is a remarkable fulfillment, but it is not yet the remarkable fulfillment. This is another example of near-far fulfillment. The Exodus is actually put there to point us forward to something even more dramatic in the future. Many of us would look forward to the cross and the empty tomb, an event that happened in connection with the Passover or the remembrance of the Exodus. And this is why Jesus is described as one like Moses. But even this is not the consummation of God's promise. We still wait its completion. Exodus continues by using the language of kingly priests. Exodus continued to explain what it meant to be a people of God. And in Exodus 19:6, we read, "You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Textually speaking, this is not so much a kingdom of priests, but a nation of king priests. But when Israel rejected this arrangement in favor of allowing Moses and Aaron to continue to represent Israel, God didn't scrap this plan of king priests, but merely postponed it. They did not get to participate in it. Again, Israel's disobedience did not negate the promise, but they could not participate in this aspect of the promise. As king priests, Israel was to mediate the promise or the gospel to all the nations. The second theme of this era is divine morality. The theme of the book of Leviticus is be holy as I am holy. And much of this book outlines the practice of sacrifices and purity laws. But the core of its teaching is found in Leviticus 18, 1 through 5. Let me read it for us. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live. And you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord." We see this repetition of God's claim to be the Lord of Israel. Some people interpret verse 5 as a conditional clause. Verse 5, which states, "Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them." But we have to remember, God 3 times in this passage states, "I am the Lord your God." And this is not a conditional statement, and it implies that God is already God to Israel, regardless of their obedience or disobedience. Notice how God is now claiming a partial fulfillment of the promise made in Genesis 3:15 to be our God. Israel's disobedience at no point canceled the promise of God. Israel's idolatry with the golden calf did not negate the 10 Commandments. The sin of the patriarchs did not prevent the transmission of the promise, nor did David's sin cancel the promise of an everlasting throne, as we will discuss. The moral law outlined in Leviticus served to separate Israel from the pagan nations which surrounded her. Israel was to be holy or consecrated. In a word, different. This law fell into 3 categories: moral law, civil law, and ceremonial law. While all of these laws reflect the character of God, and since God's character never changes, one can argue that the civil and ceremonial law had a built-in obsolescence to them. They may have been a step towards fulfilling the promise, but they, in and of themselves, were not the fulfillment of that promise. The third theme we're going to discuss is divine worship. The book of Numbers is universally avoided by Christians in the 21st century, and I fear this aversion has more to do with ignorance than its content. It's not that the content isn't interesting, it's that most people don't understand why the content is interesting. But when we look at Numbers in light of the promised plan, we see 2 reasons why this book makes significant steps towards the fulfillment of the promise. The first compelling reason is the progress God makes in dwelling with his people. In Exodus 25, God commands his people to build him a dwelling. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. And this draws directly on the language of Genesis 9:27. In fact, the word tabernacle means to dwell. And that's why sometimes Christians turn the word tabernacle into a verb, that God tabernacles with his people. This tent was to come with Israel and at all times serve as God's temporary dwelling place. When we get to the book of Numbers, a census was taken of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's where we get the title Numbers from. These tribes were arranged in the book around the tabernacle. Now, Numbers might not make for exciting reading, but when you're done reading it and you stand back and see what just happened, the tribes of Israel were physically organized in this U shape around the tabernacle where the presence of God dwelled. So we notice that God's dwelling is literally among his people. This is not the consummate fulfillment of the promise God made in Genesis 9:27, but it's a pretty amazing step in that direction. The second compelling reason to take numbers seriously involves the story of Balaam. Balaam, son of Beor, was a Gentile, yet a prophet who spoke with the Lord in a manner similar to Moses. This fact in and of itself is remarkable, that God was moving outside of Israel at this time. But even going back to Abraham, there was a Gentile priest, Melchizedek, to whom Abraham tithed. But beyond this fact, we see that both the evidence of God's faithfulness as well as another specification of the promised plan comes through this Gentile. When the Moabite Balak asked Balaam to curse Israel before engaging them in battle, Balaam said he couldn't because Israel was blessed of the Lord. This reflects the aspects of the promise given to Abram in Genesis 12, I will bless you. Furthermore, when Balak pressed Balaam on the issue, Balaam offered 7 total words of prophecy or oracles from the Lord, including this 4th word. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the peoples of Sheth. This oracle indicates that this promised one will have a scepter and will be some form of ruler. Secondly, we notice that the language in this passage sounds remarkably similar to the language of Genesis 3:15, where this promised deliverer would crush the skull of the serpent. And finally, we see the language of a star associated with this coming one, a star that plays prominently in Matthew's account of the birth of this promised one. In summary, the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, we see considerable progress in fulfilling God's promise. I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of you. God delivered Israel, who then became known as his people. God uses the language of firstborn and sonship in describing his people. We see evidence of God moving outside of Israel. God sent remarkable plagues and a miraculous destruction of Egypt in order to demonstrate his power, in order to redeem Egypt. We see that God included a mixed multitude in the Exodus, the inclusion of non-Israelites or Gentiles. So obviously, God's sign worked. We read of the oracles of Balaam, a Gentile, who gave the word of the Lord. These 2 episodes indicate that his promise to bless all peoples through Israel was already underway. We learn through the laws of Leviticus God's plan to make his people distinctively his, different from the people of Egypt and different from the people of Canaan. We learn that God makes provisions to dwell with his people through the construction of the tabernacle and the arrangement of the 12 tribes around this tabernacle. God used the ministry of Moses and those beyond Moses to make further progress in fulfilling God's promised plan. Thank you.